I'm sitting in a room across a table from two lawyers from a big firm in the big city of Seattle. A white student has filed a student grievance process against me. This is a formal complaint process that students can pursue if they believe they've experienced a violation of college policies. My college has hired these lawyers to judge whether I've given this student unfairly low grades because she's white. If they find me guilty, I stand to lose the tenured position I worked very hard to get, and it will be next to impossible to find another one. I'm sweating, my hands are clammy. I'm terrified of what may happen next. I'm a South African of Indian origin. Why am I so scared? I'm terrified because I know how dangerous racism is on US college campuses. I know from personal experience how my dress and appearance triggers racism and threats. From the experiences of other faculty of color, and from growing research that shows that discrimination against faculty of color is not uncommon. That day put me on a journey of discovery about a deeper truth of racism on US college campuses that no one wants to talk about. In the months following that frightening meeting, investigators scrutinized all my course documents, read my college emails, and interviewed my colleagues and my students to find evidence of whether I had discriminated against that student. Suddenly, I felt like a criminal. Every day, I woke up feeling vulnerable, ashamed, and frightened. I was scared I would lose my job. I was scared I would lose my community. I was scared I may end up on the street or have to leave the country. For 2 decades, I had worked hard to build up a reputation as an instructor who cared deeply for students, who fought hard for social justice. That reputation was in tatters. With my family in another country, I felt alone and abandoned. Many of my white colleagues kept a professionally safe distance from me. Feeling the stigma, I avoided contact with friends. My social relationships suffered. I grew anxious and depressed. I had trouble sleeping, and I struggled to keep up with my work. Luckily, after 9 months, the verdict came out in my favor. Both the college grievance committee and investigators from the law firm found no evidence of discrimination on my part, and it turned out the student had been rightly given the grade she had earned. I was vindicated, but the damage was done. As one can imagine, once an instructor stands accused, repudiation by admin and distancing from colleagues frequently follows, regardless of the outcome of the investigation. That is what happened to me. I didn't lose my job, but my standing in the college plummeted drastically, and the investigation damaged almost all my relationships with colleagues. I couldn't face my students. I had truly experienced one of the most demeaning and stressful forms of racism on US college campuses. But then I grew curious. Why did this happen to me? Why is this happening to other faculty of color? I was inspired to conduct research, and this is what I discovered. Faculty of color suffer from racial battle fatigue because there's a glaring contradiction between their institutions' avowed commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion and their racist policies and practices. What is racial battle fatigue? Racial battle fatigue refers to social psychological stress responses that people of color experience as a result of being repeated targets of racism, and that leads to a range of health problems. These health problems also apply to faculty of color, and this is what no one is talking about. So, what can we do to lessen the damage of racial battle fatigue? I believe there's one thing that can truly make a difference. We can use an equity lens to revise these policies and practices that contribute to racial battle fatigue. What is equity? How is it different from equality? Equality requires us to treat everyone equally without paying attention to racial discrimination in our society and in our institutions. Equity requires us to recognize that we're not all the same, that our opportunities and outcomes are not the same because of racial discrimination in our society and in our institutions. Equity requires us to not treat everyone equally, but rather to provide additional support to those who need it to ensure that our outcomes are just. How does equity apply to faculty of color? Well, when institutions hire faculty of color, they want diversity, but they may not be willing to change their racist policies and practices. Equity requires colleges to revise their policies and practices and make them responsive to the racism that faculty of color experience on their campuses. What I want to share with you now is just one of many processes that supports discrimination. The student grievance process. I'm not suggesting that students have no recourse to address injustice. I am suggesting that student grievance processes, as they stand today, allow some students to weaponize them against faculty of color. But why would students want to weaponize the grievance process against faculty of color? I believe there are at least two reasons. First, research scholars know that for many students, academia is their first encounter with people of color in positions of authority. Because of this, students may think we're just affirmative action hires who lack the credentials to be instructors. They may think we're not intelligent or competent by virtue of our race. They may project bias and presume that we discriminate based on race in ways that white faculty wouldn't. Second, research scholars also know that the more uncomfortable the subject matter is for students, the more likely it is that students will act negatively toward the instructor. A 2002 study shows that when white faculty teach about racial inequality, they experience troubling reactions from students. I'll wager that anyone who's taught in the social sciences, and especially those who've taught about race, knows exactly what that study is talking about. What is less well known is that this effect is far more pronounced for faculty of color. A 2010 study shows that students were twice as likely to challenge women faculty of color who taught identity-related content as they were white women teaching the same content. Twice as likely. So we're naive if we think that students come to academia without their own set of biases. Come on, we all have them. We're naive if we think that students come to academia with their biases and then check them at the college door. We're also naive if we think that students won't act on those biases in the classroom, in course evaluations, in student grievance processes. And finally, we're blisteringly naive if we think that those enactments of racial bias won't contribute to faculty of color leaving higher ed. As people of color, we already have a harder time getting faculty positions. Once there, we experience racism from students and colleagues. We must work harder at taking care of ourselves. We spend more time and energy supporting students and colleagues of color. And yes, we speak out against injustice because we experience more of it and risk our jobs accordingly in higher proportions. If we want to reduce racism in academia, we must first acknowledge that racism is deeply embedded in all policies and practices, from hiring to unpaid emotional labor and service work that faculty of color are expected to do, to inequitable student codes of conduct, and the list goes on. Even more appalling is that all these policies and practices are presented as though they are racially neutral, when in fact, they not only discriminate against faculty of color, but actively harm them. The student grievance process is an example of this. What did I do? I'm writing a book for Lexington Books that uses an equity framework to address racism in the academy. Served on a committee to make our student code of conduct less racist, on an equity steering committee that's ensuring that all students at my college encounter content on racial equity. Collaborated with a colleague to train tenure review committees to make the tenure process more equitable. And finally, began crafting anti-racist contract bargaining language for the Associated Federation of Teachers in Washington State. Equity and inclusion work is now my life's work. What can colleges do? Admin, if you haven't screened your policies through an equity lens, know that those policies are flawed. Screen your student evaluations of faculty for bias. Screen your student grievances for bias. Implicit association tests are meant to assess bias, but we need ones that are more generally accepted as effective in diagnosing biases. Reduce your unreasonable expectations of service work for faculty of color and compensate them for that labor. Make the tenure process more equitable. Make academia a place where faculty of color feel supported and protected. Colleges have a responsibility to ensure that education about racial equity comes early and often to students. Introducing students to racial justice concepts can't wait until the student first faces a faculty of color about whom they already have negative racial preconceptions. It can't wait until the student files a grievance. That process punishes the instructor without educating the student. I say we do this equity work. We talk about equity. We do research on equity. We examine our policies and practices through an equity lens. Then we can live our ideal of social transformation. Isn't that our goal? Imagine a world in which faculty of color are treated justly and humanely, where they're more likely to stay in the academy to teach about equity, to mentor students of color and help them to graduate. Isn't that our goal? Students who experience college as equitable, students who are racially enlightened can go out and change the world for the better. Isn't that our goal? A more equitable academy, a more equitable world. That's my vision. Isn't that our vision? Thank you.